In this video, we'll take a look at the basics of drawing and shading primitive shapes. So what primitive shapes are, they're the fundamental shapes that we use to make up any kind of form that we can see or that we can draw. And we have the sphere, and we've got the cone, the cube, the cylinder, and the torus. The torus is kind of like a donut shape, but these shapes are kind of everywhere in nature and in man-made objects, and anything you can draw is going to be made up of these shapes. You'll want to use these shapes when you're drawing and sketching to help you make more realistic drawings, and it'll just make it easier for you to draw. I think a lot of people, when they draw, they kind of go from point A to point B, and if they're drawing, a person, they pick a point and then they start drawing feet, and they go along, and that's one way to draw, but it's not always the best way to draw. The other way to do it would be to use your primitive shapes first, do a sketch, because everything is essentially going to be made up of these primitive shapes. So wouldn't it just be easier just to sketch them out first and then go over it, on a different layer, or, do another drawing and then refine it however you needed to. So I'm going to show you the easiest way to draw each of these shapes and shade them. So starting out, we'll start with the sphere. What you want to do is, if you're working on a smaller tablet, you're not going to have a lot of room to really move your arm around. So if you're doing smaller spheres, it might be easier to zoom out or something, and then might make it easier to draw. But you want to be drawing kind of with your fingertips. So you want to have your wrist planted on your tablet, and then you just kind of want to be rotating the tip of your pen, holding it very closely to the edge to make these circles. And you just kind of want to, start out lightly and let it build up, and then just kind of refine it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's pretty hard to draw a good, perfect circle this way. What's more accurate, and it's probably easier if you have a bigger tablet, is if you draw using your elbow or your wrist. So if you think about, if this is your arm and here's your hand holding your pen, when you're drawing with your fingertips, you're drawing kind of from here to make these circles, and your wrist is kind of planted here, so it's kind of constraining your pen. However, if you draw from your elbow here, then you have this range of motion that your elbow can go through, and when you're drawing with your elbow, you tend to make smoother circles. So I would, rather than thinking about drawing that circle with your pen tip, keep your pen tip on your tablet, but think about rotating, drawing that circle using your elbow. So I'm going to do that here with a big example. See how I drew a much better circle? It kind of depends. Sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't, but I end up getting generally a better, rounder shape, and it's not as rough and rugged as some of the other ones. So you can see, if I'm drawing, it's kind of hard to get a perfect circle in this way, and if you're going for a perfect circle, there's a better way to do it, and in drawing, that would be a compass. But since you don't have a compass in Corel Painter, it would be just as easy to use something like the oval selection tool and then draw a selection with that. I'm holding Shift and Alt on my keyboard to constrain it to a perfect circle and expand it from the center. If you just hold Shift, it constrains it. If you don't hold anything, then it will become elliptical, and you don't want it to do that. So hold Shift and Alt to constrain it, and now you've got a selection, and you could use that as a guide if you wanted to follow along and sketch in your circle. Or if you wanted to, you could just, if you were just going to paint a sphere, just fill in the whole thing. And there you go, you've got a sphere. So that's pretty easy to do. But you don't always want perfect spheres, and I don't recommend that that's always the way that you make them, is by using a guide. Sometimes it's just better just to try to sketch it out. I did a pretty good rough sketch there, so now I'll just go through and refine it a little bit and get it looking more spherical. So something like that is pretty good just for a sketch. It's pretty spherical. And if you wanted to, you could go through and clean it up a little bit with the eraser. And touch up a couple of the edges. There you go, you got a sphere. So now what's important, this is probably one of the easiest objects to shade. When you're shading, if you want things to look three-dimensional, you're going to have to use proper shading techniques. So let's say that our sunlight is here, and we're going to shade in all of these examples. So the light from our sun's coming out, and it's bouncing off our object, right? Because that's how light works. Okay? So more of that light, more of these photons, if you think about them as a substance, are going to hit. The most of them are going to hit at the distance that's the closest, which would be this exact point right here. So this, you know, somewhere around here, wherever this light's hitting, it might end up being like here or something, if it's three-dimensional. That's going to be the lightest point. So you want to think about having your lightest area here, and then since your object is spherical, you want your highlights to match that contour. So the contour of your piece, or of your shape here, is something like this, depending on, you know, where you are. If you think about like a globe or a basketball, that'll help you get an idea of these different contours. So when you're drawing on your sphere, you always have to keep these contours in mind. Otherwise it's not going to look right. So it's the same thing with your shading too. Your shading has to follow this spherical contour. So I'm just drawing in some guides just to show you as an example where you would want to be doing the shading. Your darkest area, of course, you would want to do on the edge that's furthest away from the light, and then the next would be a little bit lighter. And again, you can see I'm going at some weird angles with the shading too, and that's kind of helping with the whole contour thing. You could do kind of something in the middle there to kind of blend it together, and then this will be pretty light. And then in the center we won't do anything. And then if you wanted to, you could go through with a blender brush and you could blend all this together. Or you could just leave it, you know, line shaded, however you want to do it. And you can get some pretty good results here for some shading. Now, you could get smoother shading if you use something like an airbrush, of course. But this is kind of, you know, this is not a video on how I would shade things that I'm painting. This is just a video that's, you know, showing you the concepts of shading. So if you want to watch something that's more about realistic shading and rendering, you'll want to watch my video on three-dimensional shading. There we'd just do something like, you know, we'd be filling in objects. So I'd have my sphere, and then if I wanted to shade it, then I would do it like this. I would be doing it with more of a painterly way rather than like a sketchy way. So this is more like shading for people who just want to get a feel for how to shade three-dimensional objects, having had no prior experience before. So there's lots of different ways to shade, but what's important is, again, you have to maintain this contour of your object. So again, that contour, if we want to enhance it a little bit here, you know, it'd be something like, oops, let's get a color we can see here. You have to think about everything kind of wrapping around it and bulging out. So what's closest to you in the center ends up being pretty wide, and then as you get closer to these edges, everything gets kind of squished together. So you can, you know, look at some different objects that you have around the house that are spherical. That'll give you an idea of how these contours work. But once you draw a lot of these shapes, then you just start to see this in your mind, and it makes it really easy when you're shading to do these things. So that's your sphere. We're going to keep our sun in the same place over here. And let's move on to the next one. So we'll do the cone next. That one's pretty easy. There's a few ways you can do it. I kind of just freehand them in like this, and then I draw my base. But if you wanted to, you could draw the base first and then draw the cone, or if it helps, you could draw a straight line and then draw the cone down off of that. Either way, what you want is you want an elliptical shape, something like this. And again, I'm using kind of a large gesture when I'm drawing. I'm drawing with my wrist or with my elbow. And that's making it a smoother ellipse. And then off of that, if you wanted to, you could draw a straight line just by sketching it. And then up off of that end point, you could draw guides. If you wanted like a ruler or something, if you're not that great at sketching these things, you can switch your brush to straight line strokes, and then when you tap, you'll make a point, and then you'll make another point off of that, and it'll keep going sequentially. And then you can switch to freehand strokes to make it stop doing that. So if it's easier for you to do it like this, draw your cone this way, you have to kind of switch back to disengage that mode there. I don't know that that's really the best way to do it. And honestly, it's just going to be a sketch, so it's probably better if you don't rely too much on guides here. It's not going to do you any good to really have a straight cone for this purpose. And if we were going to do a three-dimensional cone, we would just illustrate it in a different way than this. We wouldn't sketch it in and then try to fill it in anyway. So it's going to erase some of this. Probably a quicker way to do that. And so for the cone, I'll just draw on a cone that we can shade here. You can see again, this is just a sketch. I'm not too worried about it. You can decide if this ellipse here is going to be the inside or the outside. Let's say that this is going to be the inside, so let's make it really dark in here, because again, our sun's up there in the top right, and I'm not going to do like the best job in the world of shading this. It's just an example. But so we've got the inside of our cone, and then again our light's coming here, it's bouncing off. Where is it hitting the most? Well, this is right somewhere in this area. So on a sphere, you're maintaining your spherical contour. Well, the contour of a cone is a little bit different. There's a tip here, and then everything comes out from that tip like this. And then there's some contour that goes like this. So let's see if I can illustrate it better. So you've got these vertical bands, these columns, and then you've got horizontal ones that kind of curve. Now, these contours also kind of depend on your angle that you're viewing the cone, but you end up with something kind of like that. So when you're shading your cone, you're going to want to have your shadow on the darkest side, and then get lighter and lighter, and then there'd be a little bit over here of kind of light shadow because your main highlight will be here in the center. So let me just draw one that doesn't look quite as sloppy. Let me just go a little bit lighter and even lighter. If you wanted to blend it, you can blend it. We'll just tighten up this top here a little bit. And then you've got your cone. Move on to the cube. Now, we've probably all drawn cubes in school at some point. If you want to make it a little easier to draw your cube straight, you can hold Shift on your keyboard. That'll constrain your lines to vertical and horizontal axes, and then you can make a square pretty easily if you want a perfect cube. Or if you just want to freehand it, they're not that hard to freehand either. You just, it might look a little more like tofu or something, but again, I'm using pretty long, pretty quick strokes, and I'm using pretty wide gestures. So these lines that you're going to draw off of it, essentially you kind of want to imagine that there's a cube face, and then behind it there's the cube back. But this area that's overlapping you can't see, you kind of have to imagine it there. Then you want to connect each corner to its matching corner, if that makes sense. So we have our cube face, this is the front of the cube, and then behind it would be the other cube. Then you would just connect the sides here. Now if you wanted to do one at a different angle, you could put the back of the cube over here, and now it's going in a different direction. Now I don't even bother drawing that extra few lines for the back side because I just kind of drawn so many cubes in my day that I can make them look pretty good, and I just kind of know where to put them initially. What's important is that these lines here, this line and this line, and eventually this line here, they all need to be the same angle pretty much for it to look right. These three lines, they all need to be pretty much the same angle. And then these lines all need to be, pretty straight on with each other too. And you can have your cube at an angle, there's no problem with that if you wanted to. But what's important is that there's a consistency in these right angles and everything. Unless you want a cube that's askew or something, then you can do it however you want. Shading the cube is pretty easy. So we'll again have our sun that's over here. It's starting to look more like a crushed spider every time I draw it, but I'm just being quick about this stuff. We'll have our cube over here, and I'll just do it like this because it's probably easier for you to do. And you also want these two cubes to be about the same size that you're drawing. We'll connect our edges, and we've got our cube, and then if you want, you could go through and you could just erase the center here. Get it nice and cleaned up. Doesn't have to be perfect, it's just a sketch, but there we go. And then our light again is coming from our sun, and it's bouncing off our cube. Now our cube is facing towards the sun, so that side that we can't see, this side here on the inside, that's getting the most sunlight, and it's just going to be a flat thing. The cubes are kind of easy to shade because generally they don't really have a whole lot of contour. So I'll go back a little bit here. So that side would be the lightest side. That side would probably be white, or whatever color you want it to be, a really bright color. The next lightest side then would be this top side, because this is the next closest side that's facing the sun, because the sun's kind of up, so it's kind of coming down, and the light's bouncing off here. So your front side that you can't see would be the lightest, the top would be the second lightest. So we'll put in a little bit of light shading and have it be slightly lighter towards the sun and slightly darker away from it, but just a subtle change. Now the absolute darkest place would be the underside of it that we can't see under here, because there'd be no sun hitting it at all. And the second darkest then would be this backside here. So we'll go ahead and just make that the darkest side. We'll shade it, doesn't matter really how you shade it, just one even tone here. And then the sides are both equally facing away from the sun, at least at the angle I have it here. So they just need to be darker than the top side and lighter than the back side. So somewhere in the middle. And then of course, where it's facing away from the sun, you can make it just ever so slightly darker. And there you go, you've got your cube. Now we could do some more at different angles here. Then you can get a feel for how this is going to work. So underside here is facing away from the light, so that's the darkest side. This side's also facing away. And this side's also facing away. This underside would be the darkest. This side would be the second darkest because it's facing away. Well, I guess these are just about equal, I would say, in how much they're not pointed towards the sun. So you'd have something like that. Could have another cube here facing this way. So these two sides are both getting a lot of light, so they would be pretty light, and then this side would be really dark. Put another cube down here, facing a different angle. You got the light coming down, hitting this side. That's the lightest side. This side's a little shadow. This back side has a lot. If you wanted to do shadow off of that, you could too. We'll worry about cast shadows in another video. So that's how you can shade cubes. We'll look at the cylinder now. The cylinder is a lot like the cone, but it's just got two open ends that are elliptical, so you can sketch in your ellipse first, or you could draw your two vertical lines first if that's easier. I was holding shift there on my keyboard to constrain. And there you go. Or you could just sketch it in freehand. It's good to get proficient at sketching things in freehand. It'll save you a lot of time, and you know, things look a little more organic when they're not so straight and perfect, I think. Has a little more character. So there's your cylinder. You could do, you know, all kinds of different cylindrical shapes, long stem and different things. So got our sun up here. Now it's going to be similar to how we shaded the cone, except the cylinder doesn't come down to a point. So it's kind of, in a way, like shading the cylinder. You just, you know, you have your side that's furthest away, that's the darkest, and then everything just gets lighter and lighter and lighter as you get towards the sun. And then it's kind of going back around the corner here. So that's why I'm putting the shadow in over here, because the lightest spot's actually right here. This is bulging out the most and pointed most towards the sun. And then of course on the inside, you know, you could just fill it in with a dark color. That would be getting some sun, but not that much because it's facing away. Same thing with this example here. Our contour is going just vertical pretty much. So you have these strips, and in each of these strips you want your color to get either lighter or darker, and then your other contour is curved a little bit and bowed depending on your angle. And finally we'll move on to the taurus, which was the donut shape, and I'm using a pretty broad gesture there, drawing with my wrist or my elbow to get the shape I want. Nice smooth ellipse. And same thing, we got our sun coming down. Now this is kind of a donut, so this is, in a way, if you were to take a cylinder and connect one end to the other, you know, like if this was the end of the cylinder and this was the other end, and they were to join up here and connect, that would be your torus. Okay, so it's just a big donut. This is one of the more complicated shapes to shade, but this is a good one to get into. The contours on the torus are kind of like this. So there's some bulging going on, and then you've got these concentric rings. It's kind of a hard thing to describe this way. If you look at some 3D models, it'll give you a better idea of what their contours are. But so if we were to go to shade this, then our darkest area would be down here at the bottom. This is where the least amount of light is going to be. And our lightest area, of course, would be up here on the top, probably somewhere like right around there, and then maybe over here. So we'd have another dark area over here, and then it would just start getting lighter. When I'm sketching, I'm kind of trying to, again, maintain these invisible contour lines that I'm imagining in my mind. Something like that. Maybe we'll just use an airbrush here to kind of speed this up a little bit. Then you can see, because this one you really kind of have to have some real shading going on here to get a feel for how this is supposed to look. You can see I'm just constantly thinking about where the darkest and the lightest areas are. And then I'm trying to make sure that everything fits in between. And that's called contrast. And the amount of contrast you have is going to make an image look a certain way. It might make it look better, it might make it look worse, it depends. But there's your torus. Blend it a little bit. And again, I'm sorry if these sketches are kind of sloppy. I don't want these videos to take like 2 hours for you to watch something that should only take like 30 minutes, so. Doing some sloppy sketches, but you know, sketches are supposed to be sloppy, so yours should be that way too. If you want to do some more refined sketches and do some drawings, you know, again, you can use your eraser and go in and clean this up and make it look really nice and get it looking however you want. But you can see from a distance, that looks pretty good. It looks like a three-dimensional shape. So the reason why it does is because I followed all these rules. I thought about where my sun is, or where my light is, what's the closest part of my three-dimensional object to that light source. I made that the lightest area, and then the areas that were furthest away or pointed away from my light source I made the darkest, and everything in between was just an even blend of color. I also kept in mind that each of these shapes have a contour. You know, they've got kind of invisible lines that you have to imagine are there, and you just gotta kind of draw them in. So, you know, these would be essentially the contour lines of this piece. But, you know, again, I didn't have to sketch that out to know that. I just kind of see it in my mind. And when you start drawing more of these shapes, it'll come naturally to you. And again, all of these shapes can be put together to make up any kind of thing that you want. You know, you can have a person that's a sphere and a cylinder and another cylinder and more spheres and more cylinders. And guess what? More spheres. You got kind of a cone there and more cylinders and, you know, so on. So everything is a primitive shape. A car, you know, again, as I mentioned, I'm not very good at drawing cars here, but, you know, a car is essentially just a bunch of primitive shapes put together. You've got something like this, the world's worst looking car. But nevertheless, you can see it's just a bunch of cubes, and, you know, the tires are kind of cylinders, and everything's going to be that way when you draw it. And if you sketch it out, it's going to look way better. I can use this horrible sketch as a guide, and I could really go through, and if I wanted to make this actually look like a car, I could refine the sketch a little bit more, make it look a little bit more legit. Again, I don't really draw cars, so I don't have the foresight to know where all the components are for it, but it gives you an idea of what you can do. And then we've got I think our tire's a bit smaller here. Again, they're just cylinders. You can see I can go through and refine my shape and make it look like it's actually almost a halfway decent car with a person driving it. And put some old school headlights on it and whatnot. So, same goes for the person. Can just use my sketch as an outline, a guide, and that will allow me to go through and make my drawing look way more accurate. So that's better than, starting from A to Z, going from A to Z and trying to draw your person, that's just not the way to draw. You're supposed to use these primitive shapes, and same thing goes for, I'll show you real quick, shading too. Again, if the sun's up there, front of the car's facing away, the tires, theirs definitely aren't getting any light, they're under there, those are really dark. The top side's getting the most light, again the top side of the hood, so inside of the car would be a little dark, and this back side would be a little dark. And there you go, you've got your car. Same thing goes with your person. That side of the head's the side that's facing away the most. Same thing goes with your cylinder, so we're shading it like a cylinder. We're shading our sphere like we were shading a sphere, because again, there's contours to everything. So our head has contours, and our torso has contours, and our leg has contours. So you have to keep all those things in mind. Our arm has, contours. So when you're shading, you have to keep all those things in mind every time you're shading. Otherwise, your stuff's just not going to look realistic. And art doesn't have to be realistic. It can be any degree of realism that you want it to be, and it can be not realistic at all. So I'm not in any way encouraging you to change your style if you want to draw things in a different way. That's what art's all about. But this gives you an idea of what shading is and how you do it and how you can use it, or how you can use primitive shapes to build up your forms and then shade them to get some good three-dimensional results. So hopefully you can use this to make some really cool looking digital artwork, and stay tuned for my next video, and thanks for watching.